šobrīd mēs sākam 4. sesiju ar 2 ziņojumiem saistītiem ar Eiropas Savienības bioloģiskās daudzveidības stratēģiju. Un šobrīd pieslēdzamies Somijai. Doktore Anne Tolvanen. Hello, Anne. Do you hear us? Jā, ziņojums būs par Somijas pieeju Eiropas Savienības bioloģiskās daudzveidības stratēģijas 2030 īstenošanā. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. So I will present Finland's approach to the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. And there has been quite comprehensive work done in our country. So I represent the Natural Resources Institute Finland, and my position is about, professorship position is about the ecology and multiple use of forests, but I presently lead a new 5-year research program on the mitigation of climate change. So the name is Climate Smart Carbon Cycle Research Program. So let's start. So, the essential elements in the EU biodiversity strategies concerning forests, and the most important, at least for forest-rich countries such as Finland, is the protection. Need to protect 30% of land area, which is in the biodiversity strategy. This is only told at the EU level, not at the country level, but we have made an assessment that based on the assumption that each country will fulfill this 30%. So 30% of land area and 10% of strictly protected land area, which means that sorry, somebody said that I turned my camera. The camera was turned off automatically, not by myself. Let's see. Seems like I'm not able to put on the camera back. Sorry, I don't know why. It's either the screen or the camera. Anyways, so the additional protection is the most important element of this biodiversity strategy. And then also the need to protect all primary and old growth forests. And for us, at least in Finland, this caused some problems in about thinking what is primary, what is old growth forest. So this terminology was found a bit difficult for us. Then there are legally binding restoration targets, and there's a need to, or the targets that there should be no deterioration of any protected areas or species by 2030. And then there's a need to plant at least 3 billion trees using ecological principles. So all of these targets, and there are many others, are directed to forests especially. And the other targets, which I list here, are they concern farming, pesticides, fertilizers, pollinators, remediation of contaminated soils, restoration of rivers, need to do urban greening projects, to reduce invasive species, which also concerns forests, and to reduce the bycatch in fisheries. So basically the biodiversity strategies concerns all ecosystems and all habitats, but I will concentrate on the forest in my talk. So, and these ambitious targets also mean that there is a big change in the whole society needed to reach these targets. So the transformative change is needed. The governance has to react to regulate the forest use and agricultural use and use of waters, so that it is possible to reach the biodiversity targets. The finance and business should react to the targets so that there is guarantee of funding to reach the biodiversity targets, because if it's only depend on the society and societal decisions, the change is not permanent. There needs to be money included in, for instance, restoration targets. Otherwise, it won't happen on a permanent basis. And then, of course, the big thing to change is the people's attitude, so that nature values, biodiversity, greenhouse gases are considered equally important as the monetary and economic values. And this means changes in, or this means increased need for knowledge and education in people. So many kinds of changes are needed if we are going to reach the biodiversity targets. So in Finland, we made a big assessment of potential impacts of the biodiversity strategy. What would happen, or how are we able to reach the targets? And this assessment was launched by the Ministries of Agriculture and Forestry and the Ministry of the Environment. And researchers both from my institute, Luke, and the Finnish Environment Institute, Syke, were involved in this assessment. My institute, Luke, works under the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, and Syke works under the Ministry of the Environment. And the report was ready just a month ago, and you can see the title page on the right. There was a big seminar about the results already in June, but the report itself got ready now, a month ago. And this is a very big, immense report, having more, like nearly 400 pages. So it looks at the biodiversity targets from many perspectives. Oops, sorry. So the content of this big assessment is it looks at each of the biodiversity targets separately. So the targets to increase protection. What are the present protection levels in Finland now? What kind of protection needs are there in carbon-rich ecosystems, which means in practice peat soils, which are heavy greenhouse gas emitters? What is the impact of increased protection levels on forestry and agriculture? And in this presentation, I will only present some calculations made on forests, on mineral soils, because this is such a comprehensive assessment. I cannot present it totally to you, so I just present one little part of it. And then the other part of the assessment was to look at the targets for restoration, what kind of possibilities there are, and what would be the impact from the perspective of pollinators, pesticides, agroforestry, and so on. So each of the EU biodiversity targets was separately looked and discussed in this assessment. So about the forests, the assessment starts by looking at how much forest we have and how much of them are protected at the moment. So about 75% of the land area of Finland is covered by forests, which is actually about 10% of the whole forest area in Europe, Western Europe. And it means that most of our ecosystems are forests, basically. So whatever happens in increased protection levels concerns very much of our forests. So when the EU says that the goal is 30% protection, including 10% of strict protection, we have to start to calculate how much forest we have, what we have in general, from which we should start to increase the protection level. So basically, from our forest land and scrubland, we already have 14% protected land. And you can see on the right, the most important protected areas, which are the Natura 2000 areas in Finland. So they are on the map, as you can see. Most of them are located in northern Finland. But there are many other conservation protection areas as well. So 14% is protected. And of the forest land, which means that our timber production land, already 10% is under strict protection. So basically, whenever we talk about protected land in Finland, it always means strict protection. So there is no cutting allowed. So more or less, the EU goal, 10% of strict protection, is already covered in Finland. But then the 20% of partially protected land, which allows some management, that's not covered in Finland. And when we look at the 14% protected land in forests and scrublands, and then about 5% protected lakes and rivers, that makes altogether 19% protected lands. So we need, in order to fulfill the 30%, we need to have 11% more protection. And of that, we estimated that about 5% of this 11% of additional protection would occur in forests, in productive forests. So when we started to do simulations, forest simulations, our assumption was that 5% of forests will be protected. So we made 3 scenarios. Business as usual is the present protection level and management level in these productive forests. Muu, meaning other, is that all old growth forests will be strictly protected. And then the rest of that 5% is other forests, which will be just partially protected. And then of the 5% extra protection, 50% will be strict protection and another 50% as partial protection. And this means that when we have this 5% target to increase in protection, it differs between the scenario 2 and 3 in terms of how much of that 5% additional protection is strictly and how much of that is non-strictly protected. And the cutting level was held constant at the present level, which is 72.4 million cubic meters. That has been the cutting level during the past years on average. The simulations were made by European Forestry Dynamics Model and also by FinFEP, which I won't present. I just present the results of the EFDM model. So if we look at the results, first please look at the left picture on the left, which tells about the forest land area in millions of hectares. And on the y-axis, there is the tree age classes. On the x-axis is tree age classes. On the y-axis, there's the million hectares. And then here on the right is the year. So it's the 3 time periods. This is past years, in fact, 2016, 2031, and 2051. And now let's look at the picture on the left, 3 pictures. And here you can see the BAU scenario, Muu, and 50-50 scenario. So the general results of this, that in all 3 scenarios, the proportion of old age classes will increase a long time. So when we go from year 2016 to 2051, the proportion of old age classes is higher than in earlier years. But then the area of young age classes, 0 to 25 years, increase in the 2 restoration or in the 2 protection scenarios more than they do increase in the present business as usual scenario. And the reason of this is that when we protect especially the old growth forests and older forests, and the cutting level is held constant, more cutting pressure is increased in the non-protected areas, and that leads into the younger age classes in the commercial forest, because there are more regeneration cuttings to get the same amount of wood as before. So the essential message is that by protecting more land area, the forest age classes in the unprotected land gets younger because of increased cuttings there. And then the right pictures on the right are stock volumes, which, as was said, that the forests get older a long time, so the stock volume also generally increases in time. But then the stock volume increases in the business as usual more than what it increases in the two restoration scenarios. And the reason is again the same, is that the cutting is directed to the commercial forests, which are not protected, and to get the same amount of wood as before, more regeneration cuttings are done and the forest gets younger and the total volume decreases. And I wonder whether there's anything new in this picture. Also, because of the forests get older with time, the proportion of thinning also increase in time. And if we look at the economic, the productivity, the net present values, they decrease slightly in the two protection scenarios relative to the business as usual. You can see here in the table that using different interest rates, the bow always has slightly bigger numbers estimate than does the two protection scenarios. So there is economic costs coming from the protection, increased protection. And in the same assessment where these different types of calculations, this was more like an example calculations which I showed. There was also a workshop for stakeholders, expert stakeholders, asking people's opinion about the biodiversity strategy and their opinions on how it would influence ecology, economy, and social aspects. I haven't translated all these different variables here, but I have classified them into three main categories: ecology, economic, and social impacts. And on the bottom, you can see that the redder the color is in the bars, the more positive the impacts were perceived to be among the stakeholders. And the further blue is that the negative impacts were perceived by the stakeholders. So generally, the stakeholders thought that the ecological impacts are mostly positive of the EU Biodiversity Strategy, which is of course an expected result, because the biodiversity aims at improving ecological state of forests. The economic impacts are in blue mostly, which means that they were the biodiversity strategy was perceived to have mostly negative impacts on everything else except the nature tourism, which is here on as blue. So metsätalous means forestry, other livelihoods, utilizing of timber, export income, and the costs of protection to the government, to the state. All those were considered to have negative impacts on the economy, except the nature tourism, which was expected to increase along with increased protection. And the social impacts were variable. Employment was perceived either negative or actually more or less like neutral, because also, of course, the nature tourism will provide more employment, but it's for different people from those who get their income from forestry. Then people's general well-being, how the nature environments are, how pleasant they are, and nature recreation were perceived that they will increase along with the increased protection. And then it was expected also that people's attitudes will improve towards nature protection. But then how the landowners can decide on the use of their own land, that was perceived negatively among the respondents. And expected impacts on biodiversity were not really calculated based on these models because there are not proper models yet on that. But kind of an estimation of what happens on the basis of increased protection, of course, is that the biodiversity improves because that's the reason of protection, of course. Then the biodiversity improves also because there are more old-growth forests which are protected. Then the negative impact of biodiversity is caused by the younger age classes increasing in commercial forests because of the increasing cutting pressure on these in these commercial forests. And then if low productive peatlands will be protected more, there is a positive impact on biodiversity and not really trade-off between the economic benefits because those peatlands will not be used for timber production anyways. So otherwise there was a kind of a trade-off between biodiversity protection and economic benefits, but not in low productive peatlands. And then if low productive agricultural peat soils will be put aside from production and protected, that's a big question because then there should be some monetary incentives and compensation and many kind of economic supports so that the landowners would set their cultivated lands aside from agriculture. And carbon compensation incentives will be one big thing to be discussed in this topic in the future. So the conclusions about this forest assessment is that keeping the cumulative cuttings at present level is possible if we increase 5% the protection. But there are some trade-offs so that the surface area of young forest will increase. And the missing thing was that it was not possible to evaluate how protection will influence the wood supply. That is there enough wood and how that will influence the consequent cutting. So this kind of a feedback was not really investigated here. And also that if forests with large tree volume, the old growth forests, if they are protected and we have if we have a pressure to increase our cuttings under the bioeconomy development, it may not be possible to increase the cutting and protect 5% of land, especially if the forests are old growth forests. And or if we did that, there would be remarkable cost to the states from increased protection. So there is a trade-off. And the conclusions of the whole assessment, of which I only looked at one small perspective. The conclusion sentence has been that Finland has some readiness for implementation of EU Biodiversity Strategy. So this is a kind of a wary yes or careful yes. But it's not fully readiness. And of course, when this was done by researchers, there's lots of questions the researchers pose, saying that the evaluation of the impacts is just preliminary. The quality of data varies from different ecosystems and from different, the pollinations and so on. So that influences the predictions on the impact of the biodiversity strategy. And more comprehensive economic assessment would be needed than what was possible in this assessment. There is more info needed for synergies and trade-offs. We need to develop research, monitoring, and statistics. And some of the EU's targets can be interpreted in various ways, such as, for instance, the term what old growth forest means. So these are kind of the disclosure of the researchers. Generally calling for more research, like always happens after all reports and assessments. And if you want to know more of this assessment, please turn to Leena Kärkkäinen, who was the coordinator of this assessment. I was not even involved here, but I just have kind of monitored what happens here. And to see, okay, so this is my presentation. Thank you. I will stop sharing because I don't see anything otherwise.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. And all the questions what we will get, we will send to you for the written form answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.